What if I told you that the most powerful military empire on Earth was defeated not by a superior army, but by a series of catastrophic decisions made by one overconfident general who refused to admit he was wrong? And what if that single defeat changed the entire course of world history in ways that nobody in London, Paris, or Philadelphia could have ever predicted? On the 17th of October, 1777, a British general walked across a muddy field in upstate New York and handed his sword to an American officer. Behind him stood nearly 6,000 soldiers, the remains of one of the finest armies in the world, now prisoners of war. They had marched south from Canada expecting to crush a rebellion. Instead, the rebellion crushed them. Now here is what makes this moment so extraordinary. Just months earlier, in the drawing rooms of London, the mood was not worried. It was impatient. The British had the most powerful military on Earth, a global empire financing it, and the Royal Navy dominating every harbor on the Atlantic seaboard. Parliament assumed the whole rebellion was a tantrum that would burn itself out once the colonists realized they could not actually fight a modern European army. The Continental Army had been chased out of New York the previous autumn. George Washington's troops were camped in frozen hills of New Jersey, barely holding together. Desertions were constant. Enlistments were expiring. The Continental Congress was printing paper money that nobody trusted. They had every reason to believe this thing was almost over. And yet, by the following February, France had signed a formal military alliance with the United States, and the entire war had changed forever. So what happened between that mud-soaked field and the halls of Versailles? How did an army that was supposed to end a revolution end up handing the revolution exactly what it needed to survive? That is exactly what I am going to walk you through today, and I promise you, the answer is far more fascinating than anything you learned in a history classroom. Before I take you back to that muddy field in October, I want to say something to everyone watching right now. If you have been with this channel for a while, thank you. You are the reason I keep digging into these stories. And if you are new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because every week we go deep into the moments that actually shape the world you are living in today. Now, let us get into it. To understand why Saratoga happened, you have to understand the plan that was supposed to prevent it from ever becoming necessary. In the winter of 1776 and 1777, British strategists gathered in the offices of Whitehall in London and designed what they believed was the campaign that would end the American Revolution once and for all. The concept was elegant, almost beautiful in its logic. A powerful British army would march south from Canada through the wilderness of upstate New York, following the natural invasion corridor of Lake Champlain and the Hudson River, with Albany as the final objective. At the same time, the main British force in New York City would push northward up the Hudson to meet them. A third column would strike east through the Mohawk Valley from the west. When all three columns converged, they would control the entire Hudson corridor, slicing the 13 colonies in two. New England, the beating heart of the rebellion, would be cut off from the rest. On paper, it was genius. But here is what most history lessons leave out. This plan had a fatal flaw baked into it from the very beginning, and that flaw was not tactical. It was strategic. The general commanding the main force in New York City never received a clear, unambiguous order to march north and link up with the invasion force coming from Canada. The coordination that the entire plan depended on was never truly locked in. That single failure of communication and command would cost the British Empire more than anyone in London could have imagined. Now, the man who lobbied hardest for this campaign and ultimately won command of it was a fascinating and deeply flawed figure. He was 54 years old, a veteran of the 7 Years' War, a member of Parliament, and a man who wrote plays in his spare time. His soldiers called him Gentleman Johnny, and that nickname tells you almost everything you need to know. He was charming, articulate, socially ambitious, and absolutely convinced of his own genius. He traveled on this wilderness campaign with a personal wine cellar, a portable writing desk, multiple changes of uniform, and his mistress, who happened to be the wife of one of his own officers. He had pitched this entire invasion plan directly to the king and to the Secretary of State for the American colonies, and both men had approved it with enthusiasm. He sailed for Canada in the spring of 1777 with the confidence of a man who had already written his victory speech. His army was formidable, roughly 7,800 troops in total. About 4,000 were British regulars, disciplined soldiers trained in the linear tactics of European warfare. Another 3,100 were German mercenaries, professional soldiers rented out to the British Crown by their own princes, tough and experienced but deeply unhappy about being shipped across the Atlantic to fight someone else's war. The rest were a patchwork of loyalist volunteers, French-Canadian militia, and several hundred Native American warriors from nations along the frontier. And behind all of them, stretching back through the wilderness, was a baggage convoy packed with ammunition, rations, engineering equipment, and the general's personal luxuries. He also dragged along a massive artillery train of more than 130 cannons, a decision that would haunt every mile of the campaign ahead. This was not an army built for a wilderness march. This was an army built for a victory parade. And that distinction was about to matter enormously. The first phase of the invasion went almost too well, and that is exactly where the trouble started. On the 6th of July, the British forces captured Fort Ticonderoga, the American stronghold on Lake Champlain, virtually without firing a shot. The American garrison abandoned the fort in the middle of the night after British artillery was hauled up to the summit of a nearby mountain, giving them a clear line of fire straight down into the fortifications. The garrison fled south in a panic, leaving behind hundreds of cannons, tons of supplies, and dinner still sitting on the tables. When the news reached London, the king reportedly burst into the Queen's chambers, shouting that he had beaten all the Americans. And back in the colonies, the fall of Ticonderoga sent shockwaves through Congress. If that fortress could fall that easily, what hope did anyone have of stopping the invasion? But here is where overconfidence began writing the first chapter of a disaster. Instead of continuing south by water, which would have been faster, logistically simpler, and far less exhausting, the British commander chose to push his army overland through 23 miles of dense virgin forest. He made this choice partly to maintain the appearance of an unstoppable land advance, and partly on the advice of a local loyalist who had personal financial interests in a road being built through that very area. That detail alone should make you pause. A campaign that could determine the fate of an empire was partially shaped by a real estate conflict of interest. The American response to this decision was nothing short of masterful. The commander of the Northern Department understood that he could not stop the British in a pitched battle with the demoralized troops he had available. So instead, he ordered the most aggressive scorched earth campaign of the entire Revolution. American work parties felled enormous trees across every road and trail. They destroyed every bridge in the line of march. They dammed creeks to flood the low ground, rolled boulders into narrow forest passes, burned every standing crop, slaughtered or drove off every head of cattle, and stripped the countryside bare. What should have been a march of 2 or 3 days turned into a crawling nightmare that lasted more than 3 weeks. The British were hacking through tangled wilderness in brutal July heat, building 40 bridges and a log causeway stretching over 2 miles of swamp, all while dragging those 130 cannons over terrain that swallowed wheels up to the axles. And the further south they pushed, the more American militia companies materialized in the forests around them, sniping at foragers, ambushing supply wagons, and disappearing back into the trees they knew by heart. Then came an incident that accelerated everything in a direction the British never anticipated. A young loyalist woman who was traveling to reunite with her fiancé serving in the British Army was killed and scalped by Native American warriors, who were supposed to be allied with the British forces. Now here is the deeper story that most accounts skip over. The British commander was genuinely outraged and demanded punishment for the killers. But one of his most trusted generals persuaded him that punishing the native warriors would drive them out of the campaign entirely and could provoke retaliation against British troops. So nothing was done, and that silence became a propaganda catastrophe. The American commanding general wrote a public letter directly blaming the British commander for inciting his allies to commit these atrocities, describing the murdered woman as a young lady of beauty and fortune, and citing over 100 similar victims. George Washington personally wrote to militia officers across New England urging them to take up arms. The story spread like wildfire. Recruitment surged. Men who had been sitting on the fence, unsure whether to risk their lives, grabbed their muskets and marched north. The very alliance with native warriors that was supposed to terrorize the frontier into submission was instead driving thousands of armed volunteers straight into the American camp. And then came the blow that cracked the foundation of the entire campaign. A detachment of roughly 700 troops, mostly German soldiers and loyalists, was sent on a raid toward the town of Bennington in what is now Vermont, looking for horses, cattle, wagons, and supplies. British intelligence reported the area was lightly defended and filled with loyalist sympathizers who would welcome the crown. Those intelligence reports were catastrophically wrong. What that detachment found waiting near Bennington was a force of about 2,000 furious New Hampshire and Vermont militiamen under a veteran commander who knew frontier fighting in his bones. On the morning of the 16th of August, 1777, the Americans attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. The fighting was ferocious and close. By the time the sun set, the British had lost nearly 1,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. That was 1/8 of the entire invasion force, gone in a single afternoon. Not a single horse was gained. Not one head of cattle. Not one wagon of supplies. And the cracks spreading through the campaign were now impossible to ignore. Now I need to tell you about something that the original story of Saratoga almost always leaves out, and I think it is one of the most remarkable details of the entire campaign. While the British were stumbling through the wilderness and hemorrhaging men at Bennington, the Americans were doing something on the bluffs south of Saratoga that would prove to be the true masterstroke of the entire war. They were building one of the most brilliantly designed defensive positions in the history of the American Revolution, and the man responsible for it was not an American at all. He was a 30-year-old Polish military engineer who had walked into Benjamin Franklin's Philadelphia shop the previous year, carrying no letters of recommendation, no connections, and no credentials that anyone in America could verify. When he introduced himself and offered his services, Franklin asked him for references. The young man had none. Instead, he simply asked to take a placement examination in military engineering and fortification design. Franklin's response was almost amused. He asked who would even proctor such an exam when there was nobody in the Continental Army familiar enough with those subjects to grade it. But somehow, this stranger from across the ocean was accepted, commissioned, and eventually assigned to the Northern Army. And what he did with a series of bluffs overlooking a bend in the Hudson River changed everything. He surveyed the terrain between the two armies and identified a position called Bemis Heights, a commanding elevation with a clear view of the only road to Albany on one side and dense forest protecting the flanks on the other. He designed an interlocking system of earthworks, parapets, trenches, and fortified positions that turned that natural terrain into something approaching impregnable. When the American commander later reflected on why his army had won, he said something that I think deserves to be far better known than it is. He said that the great tacticians of the campaign were the hills and the forests, which a young Polish engineer was skillful enough to select for his encampment. That quiet, methodical genius helped determine the outcome of the American Revolution, and most Americans have never heard his name. By mid-September, the British commander had crossed the Hudson River on a bridge of boats and was marching south toward that position with fewer than 6,000 effective troops. The American force had swelled to between 12,000 and 15,000 men, with militia arriving in a steady stream from across New England and upstate New York, farmers and blacksmiths and shopkeepers who had never fought a pitched battle in their lives, but who had heard what happened at Bennington and believed, maybe for the first time, that the British could actually be stopped. The first major clash came on the 19th of September, 1777, at a clearing called Freeman's Farm, roughly a mile north of the American fortifications. The American general wanted to fight a purely defensive battle, content to sit behind those earthworks and let the British come to him. But his most aggressive field commander argued passionately that sending forces forward into the woods to meet the British in the open would give American fighters the terrain advantage where their skills at woodland combat would be decisive. That argument won out, and what followed was some of the most savage fighting of the entire war. For nearly 4 hours, the two sides hammered each other across that clearing. American riflemen armed with long rifles, accurate at distances that seemed almost impossible, picked off British officers and artillery crews with methodical, devastating precision. The British would fix bayonets and charge, driving the Americans back into the tree line. Then American reinforcements would pour in and the British would lose every yard they had gained. By nightfall, the British technically held the field, but they had suffered nearly 600 casualties, including a devastating number of experienced officers. The Americans lost about 300. It was, as military historians would later call it, a Pyrrhic victory. The kind of win that quietly destroys an army from within. Then came 18 days that I want you to really sit with for a moment. The British dug in and waited. They waited for reinforcements from New York City that were never truly coming. They waited for supplies that did not exist. They waited for their situation to improve. And every single day, it got worse. American numbers kept climbing. At night, raiding parties slipped through the darkness to steal horses, pick off sentries, and burn supply caches. British soldiers were on half rations, then less. The horses were eating bark. The Native American warriors, reading the situation with the clarity that comes from having no political ego invested in the outcome, quietly disappeared into the forest. And still, the British commander drank champagne at dinner and refused to order a retreat. On the 7th of October, 1777, he played his last card. He sent roughly 1,500 troops forward to probe the American left flank, looking for any weakness that might let him break through to Albany. What happened next was the moment this entire campaign had been building toward. The Americans spotted the movement almost immediately and launched a full-scale counterattack that hit the British from multiple directions at once. And then, in the middle of that chaos, a figure appeared on the battlefield that no one expected to see there. He was a general who had been formally relieved of his command after a furious dispute with his superior officer, a man who had spent the previous 18 days pacing in his tent, burning with rage at the injustice of being sidelined while his army fought without him. Against direct orders, and by some accounts not entirely sober, he galloped onto the field on a brown horse and threw himself into the fight with the reckless energy of a man who had decided he no longer cared what happened to him. He rode between the lines, rallying broken units, directing attacks, physically leading charges into positions that should have been suicidal. He was everywhere at once, a magnetic, screaming force that pulled the entire American assault forward like a tide. He led a direct charge against the fortified German position that anchored the entire British right flank, and his men swarmed over the defenses and took it. Then his horse was shot from under him. The falling animal came down on his left leg and shattered it, the same leg he had broken years earlier fighting for this same country. He went down in the mud, screaming in pain. When that key defensive position fell, the entire British line unraveled. Troops retreated in disorder as darkness and rain closed in. And one of the most capable and beloved British commanders on the field, a man who had been riding his horse back and forth along the crumbling line, trying to hold it together through sheer personal courage, was brought down by a rifle shot from an estimated 300 yards away. When he fell, the last thread of British cohesion snapped with him. And somewhere on that battlefield, lying in the mud with a shattered leg, was a man who in that moment was arguably the greatest combat commander the American Revolution had ever produced. At Saratoga today, there is a monument honoring his heroism. It depicts a single boot representing his wounded leg. It bears no name, because 3 years later, that same man would attempt to hand the fortress at West Point over to the British in exchange for 20,000 British pounds. And his name would become the most infamous word for betrayal in American history. After the fall of that key position, there was nothing left for the British commander to do but run. His battered army stumbled northward through pouring rain over roads that had turned to rivers of mud. The wounded had to be abandoned where they lay. American forces closed in from every direction. Militia units had already cut the roads to the north. Within 4 days, the entire British invasion force found itself completely surrounded, huddled in a shrinking perimeter on the heights above the Hudson River, with American artillery firing from across the water with impunity, sharpshooters making it lethal to stand upright anywhere in camp. No food, no ammunition to spare, and no escape route in any direction. Every officer could see what was coming. On the 17th of October, 1,777, nearly 5,800 soldiers laid down their arms. It was the largest surrender of British troops on a foreign battlefield in living memory. Now here is where I want you to understand something that goes far beyond the battlefield, because what happened next is the reason Saratoga deserves to be called the pivot point of the entire modern world. In Paris, an American diplomat had been working for months to convince the French court that the American cause was worth backing openly. France had already been secretly funneling weapons, gunpowder, and money to the rebels through front companies for over a year, but the French government refused to commit publicly while the Americans kept losing. Saratoga changed that calculation overnight. When the news of an entire British field army surrendering reached Versailles in December of 1777, the French foreign minister made his decision. If the Continental Army could surround and capture a professional British force of nearly 6,000 men, this was no longer a desperate peasant revolt. This was a winnable war. And France saw a once-in-a-generation opportunity to humiliate its oldest rival. On the 6th of February, 1778, France signed 2 treaties with the United States, one of commerce and one of formal military alliance. And buried inside that alliance was a secret clause allowing Spain and other European powers to join as well. Spain officially entered the war in 1779. The Netherlands followed. Britain went from facing a colonial rebellion to standing alone against half of Europe, forced to defend its far-flung colonies and its home islands simultaneously, spreading its military and financial resources thinner with every passing month. And there is one consequence of all this that almost nobody talks about. France accumulated over 1 billion livres in debt financing this war. That financial strain became one of the direct causes of the French Revolution in 1789. Think about that for a moment. The shots fired in the forests of upstate New York in the autumn of 1777 helped topple the French monarchy 12 years later. History does not move in straight lines. It moves in dominoes. The British commander returned to England and spent the rest of his life explaining what went wrong, blaming the confused orders from London, blaming the general who sailed south to Philadelphia instead of marching north, blaming the wilderness, the weather, the sheer impossible logistics of fighting a war 3,000 miles from home. He drifted back to the theater, wrote a moderately successful comedy, and died in 1792, remembered not for his wit or his plays, but for losing an entire army in the woods of New York. And the man who was arguably the true hero of those two battles, the man with the shattered leg and the nameless monument, watched someone else receive all the credit and all the glory. His resentment curdled into something that would define his legacy forever. Benjamin Franklin, when he heard the news of his betrayal, reportedly said that Judas had sold only one man. This man had sold 3 million. Saratoga is the story of what happens when arrogance meets preparation, when an empire mistakes its own power for invincibility, and when ordinary people, farmers with muskets, a Polish engineer with no resume, and a furious general with a broken leg, refuse to accept the outcome that everyone else has already decided is inevitable. If this story moved you, do me a favor and subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment below and tell me which moment of this campaign you think truly sealed the fate of the British invasion. I read every single one of your comments, and I will see you in the next one.